We now come to the urgent question. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement on the IMF outlook.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has three economic priorities. Our plan for this year is to halve inflation, grow the economy and get debt falling. It is a plan that will alleviate the pressure on businesses and families today and equip us to become one of the most prosperous countries in Europe. As the IMF said in its press conference today, we think that the UK is on the right track. It also said that the UK had done well in the last year, with growth revised upwards to 4.1%, one of the highest growth rates in Europe for 2022. Since 2010, the UK has grown faster than France, Japan and Italy, and since the EU referendum, we have grown at about the same rate as Germany. Cumulative growth over the 2022-24 period is predicted to be higher than Germany and Japan, and at a similar rate to the United States of America. And the Governor of the Bank of England has said that any UK recession this year is likely to be shallower than previously predicted. The actions we are taking, from unleashing innovation across AI, financial services and a host of other sectors, to improving technical education and protecting infrastructure investment, will spur and fuel economic growth in the years to come, benefiting industry and communities alike. However, Mr. Speaker, the figures from the IMF do confirm that we are not immune to the pressures hitting nearly all advanced economies. We agree with the IMF's focus on the high level of inflation in our country, which is why it is our top priority. Inflation is the most insidious tax rise there is, and so the best tax cut now is to reduce inflation. It will help families across the country with the cost of living. As the Chancellor has said, short-term challenges, especially ones we are focused on tackling, should not obscure our long-term forecasts. If we stick to our plan to halve inflation, the UK is still predicted to grow faster than Germany and Japan over the coming years. That will help us deliver a stronger economy, one that is growing faster and where everywhere across our country people have opportunities for better paying good jobs. That is what people in this country expect and what we are working tirelessly to deliver.
Rachel Reeves.
Mr. Speaker, Britain has huge potential, but 13 years of Tory failure has been a drag anchor on our prosperity. Today's IMF assessment holds a mirror up to the wasted opportunities, and it is not a pretty sight. The UK is the only major economy forecast to shrink this year. Weaker growth compared to our competitors for both of the next 2 years. The world upgraded, Britain downgraded. Growth even worse than sanctions hit Russia. The IMF chief economist singles out higher mortgage rates as a reason for Britain's poor performance. The Tory mortgage penalty is devastating family finances and holding back our economy. And British businesses are paying the price for the gaping holes in the Tories' Brexit deal. It will fall to Labour to clean up this mess. Now, if the Chancellor had ideas, answers or courage, he would be here today. But he is not. The question that the people of our country are now asking is this: are me and my family better off after 13 years of Conservative government? The answer is no. And as the IMF showed today, it doesn't have to be this way. Now, I'm sure the Minister will clutch at straws and say everything is fine or the IMF forecasts are just wrong. But can he explain why the UK is still the only G7 economy that is smaller now than it was before the pandemic? Why is the UK the only G7 economy with its growth forecast downgraded this year? Why are we at the bottom of the league table both this year and next year too? And can the Minister answer this? Why should anyone trust the Conservatives with the economy ever again?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady, grateful for her questions, but she talks about 13 years of failure. Let me just repeat the actual facts of the matter. Since 2010, the UK has grown faster than France, Japan and Italy. the Shadow Chancellor talks about the next 2 years. As I said, the forecast is from the IMF is that cumulative growth over the 22-24 period is predicted to be higher in the UK than Germany and Japan, and at a similar rate to the US. I am actually grateful that the Shadow Chancellor is quoting the IMF, because I'm going to quote the IMF too. Let's go to the press conference at about 3 a.m. this morning, Mr. Speaker, which I'm sure you were eagerly watching, and quote their economic counsellor, Pierre-Olivier Gorinchas, who said, "Let's start with the good news. The UK economy has actually done relatively well in the last year. We've revised growth upwards to 4.1%. That's one of the highest growth rates in Europe in that region for that year, 2022. That's from the IMF press conference this morning, Mr. Speaker. But the crucial point is this: the Shadow Chancellor did actually give a very passing reference to the pandemic. Usually it's their habit to completely airbrush out of history the fact that we as a government have overseen two of the greatest challenges in our history as a country, a pandemic followed by the invasion of Ukraine. Well, I know why the Shadow Chancellor doesn't want to talk about the pandemic, because let's just remember, back in December 2021, when the Welsh administration, the Labour Welsh administration wanted to lock down in the face of Omicron, we took the brave decision as a government not to lock down in England. And if we'd have taken their advice, let's remember what the Shadow Health Secretary said at the time. He said, "We believe that Plan B is insufficient. There are additional measures that are necessary." They would have kept us locked down for longer. We took the decision to keep our country open, and that's particularly because of the vaccine, which we brought forward, which they would not have done so. But I just want to make this final point, Mr. Speaker. I've said the crucial point is inflation. It's bearing down on inflation, which gives us the best chance of restoring sustainable growth. And a key facet of dealing with inflation is fiscal discipline. Now, we've heard from the Shadow Chancellor recently that Labour is suddenly the party of sound money. Well, since the speech, I think it was 2 weeks ago, in which the leader of the Labour Party promised to put away the great big government chequebook, they've made £45 billion of unfunded spending commitments. So we all know where that ends. They start writing blank cheques. It ends with a letter from their Chief Secretary to the rest of the country saying there's no money left.
Chair of the Select Committee, Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And will the Minister take this opportunity to reflect on last year when, despite the headwinds of the coronavirus, an invasion of Ukraine, huge hikes in energy costs, rising interest rates, high inflation in this country, the UK's businesses managed to generate over 4.1% of economic growth, twice the economic growth of the United States, 25% higher than economic growth in China, and higher than the Eurozone.
Well, the Chair of the Select Committee is spot on. Instead of talking down our economy, Mr. Speaker, she is making the key point that despite all of those challenges, we had strong growth last year, and the reason is because of British enterprise. And that's why on Friday the Chancellor, himself a former entrepreneur, I don't think there's many on the opposite benches, that's why we're going to back advanced manufacturing and the high growth sectors to ensure we continue to deliver that level of growth in future.
SNP spokesperson Stuart Hulsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suppose it's apposite there's an urgent question on a potential recession on the third anniversary of Brexit. The IMF have said that the UK economy would face a downgrade, the only G7 country to be facing recession, reflecting, they say, tighter fiscal and monetary policies and the still high energy retail prices weighing on household budget. And there's no getting away from it. With even sanctioned Russia forecast to grow, this is a gloomy prognosis. But given the government only expect to meet their own new fiscal rule on public sector net debt by a paltry £9 billion in 27-28, according to the OBR, there's also no fiscal headroom to provide more support because of the government's own strictures. So is this not the time to reduce the energy companies' investment allowance, which allows them to reduce the tax they pay by 91 pence in the pound to start to generate a meaningful windfall tax required to both further support the economy and households and SMEs who will otherwise see their energy costs rocket this year two of the main drivers of the IMF forecast?
I'll say to the honourable gentleman, he talks about tight fiscal monetary policy. Of course, we are faced with inflation. It's higher in the UK than in 14 countries in the EU, Mr. Speaker. This is a global challenge with inflation. So he's right, we do need to have that stance. Obviously, we want to get inflation down. But I would just point out, he talks about the cost of energy bills. That's precisely why this winter a typical household in the United Kingdom will have received £1,300 of support, £1,400 in cost of living payments, and the energy price guarantee estimated by the OBR to be worth £900 for the typical household. That's support provided to every single part of the United Kingdom. But on his specific suggestion, and to be fair, he's making a specific fiscal proposal in relation to the allowance. What I would say is that that's going to hurt one particular sector. It's going to hurt the North Sea. It's going to hurt investment in UK energy. And do you know what the long-term answer to this is? It's not supporting families. We're doing that very generously at the moment. The long-term answer is energy security, investing in nuclear and investing in the North Sea as part of our transition to net zero.
Sir Edward Lee. If the Minister is not able to share with the House the advice he has received from the opposition on how they are going to reduce public spending and taxation if they ever form a government, will he at least accept my advice that the message from successful enterprise economies is we must have a credible plan to reduce corporation tax and regulation on business?
Well, great respect for my honourable friend, who is very consistent on these points. I'm bound to point out that even with the forecast increases, corporation tax will still be the lowest in the G7 headline rates. And of course, roughly 70% of businesses don't pay that higher rate because of the small business rate that pertains. I haven't received any representations from the party opposite, I can say to him, other than a pledge for sound money from a party which, since promising to put away the great big government chequebook, has announced almost £50 billion of unfunded spending commitments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Despite the Minister's bluster, the benches opposite are empty. They haven't come in large numbers to defend the government's economic results, have they? And that is because the IMF is a devastating forecast which lays bare the economic incompetence of this government. Only sanctioned Russia is still doing better than we are. This government is unfit to run the economy, as unfit as the Treasury bench is to be in the Treasury.
Well, I'm pleased to say there is very colourful support on our backbenches. And I'm sure there'll be further pertinent and brilliant questions to come. And I just say to the Honourable Lady, she quotes the IMF, I simply reiterate what their economic councillor said this morning about the UK. He said, let's start with the good news. The UK economy has actually done relatively well in the last year. We've revised growth upwards to 4.1%. That's one of the highest growth rates in Europe. That's exactly what the IMF said.
Sir Desmond Sway.
What should the IMF make of our burgeoning £65 billion trade surplus in financial services?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, the IMF always stressed the importance of sustainable growth. It's sustainable growth that matters. And of course, my friend's absolutely right, exports are crucial to that. The city and financial services is a massive UK success story. We want to build on that. That's why we've announced the Edinburgh reforms and further measures to strengthen UK financial services. We're quite clear the future for this country is optimistic, and we get there by backing brilliant British business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister talks about COVID, the pandemic, as if this is the only country that experienced the pandemic. Yeah, exactly. The Minister talks about the Ukraine crisis as if the fuel costs are only affecting this country, but he fails to mention that the former Prime Minister and her Chancellor crashed the economy on top of the uncertainties of the previous years following the failure to get a decent deal after Brexit, which has hit our economy with a 4% hit on output, £55 billion of fiscal consolidation because of the failure of his government. When is he going to admit to that and face up to the reality instead of misleading the British people?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the total contrary, I think the whole point of why we mentioned the pandemic in Ukraine is not to say that we're the only country affected. On the contrary, it's to explain that these are global headwinds that we face as a country. And the Honourable Lady talks about energy costs. To be absolutely clear, the OBR's forecast in relation to the energy price guarantee is that it will reduce the peak of inflation in this country by 2.5%. Inflation is an issue, it is global, but we are taking strong measures in this country to ensure we deliver the Prime Minister's target of halving inflation.
Isn't it right that the IMF actually welcomed the autumn statement and said that it struck the right balance between fiscal responsibility, protecting growth and vulnerable households? And given what we've heard, that the IMF have also said cumulative UK growth over 2022-24 is predicted to be higher than Germany and Japan, similar to the USA, isn't this exactly why we should stick to the measures set out in that autumn statement?
Well, my honourable friend makes a brilliant point. She reminds us not only did the IMF this morning talk about our strong performance in 2022, of course, at the autumn statement they welcomed those measures. They recognised there had to be a balance struck between fiscal consolidation, but as she says, doing it in a way that supports the most vulnerable. And the best example of that I can give is that from April, far from withdrawing support with high energy costs, there will be a new £900 payment for families on benefits, and it shows we are getting the balance right between the fiscal discipline necessary to ensure we work the Bank of England to reduce inflation, but ensuring families are supported through these challenging times.
Emma Hardy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the government's response to the IMF forecast has been to simply say that the forecast is wrong. So if the government won't look at the forecast, let's look at the facts. The UK is the only G7 economy smaller now than it was at the start of the pandemic. And growth has been lower under the Conservatives than it was under the last Labour government. So can the Minister tell us whether the government has any respect for our international economic institutions?
Minister. I didn't question the IMF forecast. That is not correct. I simply quoted what they'd said, which is that cumulative growth over the 2022-24 period is predicted to be higher than Germany and Japan, and at a similar rate to the US.
Clark. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I remind the Minister and the Right Honourable Lady opposite that forecasts are just that. They're subject to substantial revision. I remember in 2012 when the IMF downgraded the forecast only substantially to upgrade it the following year. The key thing is to have a long-term approach. So will the Minister confirm that the Government will build on the Prime Minister's May's lecture and the Chancellor's excellent speech on Friday and complement that with a clear industrial strategy so that investors can have a clear view of the Government's business policy as countries like the US, Japan and South Korea are doing?
Minister. Well, my right honourable friend obviously speaks with great expertise, both as a former Secretary of State and Select Committee Chair. He's absolutely right. Whatever forecasts say, we have got a clear strategy for long-term sustainable growth in this country. It comes from supporting high-growth sectors, and in particular, and I'm glad he mentioned the speech on Friday, the Chancellor spoke about the fact that we are only the third economy in the world with $1 trillion tech sector. I know the Shadow Chancellor doesn't like this fact. We are only the third economy in the world with $1 trillion tech sector. We should be proud of that. But of course we want to build on it further. That's how we deliver strong, sustainable growth in every part of the United Kingdom.
Sarah Olney. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The UK economy has faced a triple whammy in recent days. The IMF forecast saying that the UK is the only major economy which will slide into recession this year, an ONS survey setting out the true horror of this winter of discontent, and insolvency figures out today showing more companies going bust than at any point since the 2009 crisis. Can the Minister tell me when and where will the Brexit benefits begin?
Minister. Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, as ever. Of course, she misses out the fact that we have the lowest unemployment for the best part of 50 years. We should all be very proud of that. We know the scars that are caused by high unemployment. We know that in the pandemic, when it started, unemployment was predicted to finish 2 million higher than it ended up because of the measures taken by this government, by the Prime Minister when he was Chancellor, furlough and so on, and we're going to continue supporting households. She talks about the winter of discontent. As I said, £1,300 of support for a typical family this winter with their energy bills. That shows we're on their side, but we need to go further, and we do that by delivering on the target to halve inflation.
The Right Honourable Lady opposite mentions that our growth rate is not as great as Russia. What she doesn't mention, Mr. Speaker, is that the IMF said that of Germany too, because both Germany and the United Kingdom are dependent on gas. But my question to my right honourable friend is how many times over the last 10 years has the IMF had to revise their economic forecast? If he doesn't know the answer, would he please write to me?
It would be a pleasure, as ever, to write to my honourable friend. But I would just point out, he mentioned about dependent on gas. Last year, we should be very proud of the fact that over 40% of our electricity was generated from renewables, just 1.5% from coal. We've had the fastest falling emissions in the G7. And as a recent report confirmed in the Times, we can get those lower emissions with higher growth. And they said that jobs in the net zero sectors paid £10,000 more than the national average. The Times reported in particular that South Yorkshire, North Derbyshire, Tyneside and Teesside are all hotspots for net zero jobs, and it shows that we can deliver on net zero and deliver economic growth.
Habib Jassin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister think Tory austerity, Tory Brexit, or the Tory trust budget is responsible for the unique mess our economy is in, or is it all of the above?
Minister. Well, as I said, it's very far from a unique mess when 14 EU countries have a higher rate of inflation than we do. That's why we're focused on inflation. And just to be clear, that will take some difficult decisions. And I think it would help in that regard if members opposite, instead of living in a parallel universe where their leadership and their shadow chancellor talk about sound money, but not a single one of them ever do or even venture to understand it, they need to start showing what difficult decisions they would actually take, because that's how you run the country.
Blake Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And getting the economy moving forward more quickly will depend on supporting investment and research and development. Will my honourable friend look at ensuring that R&D continues to be incentivised as a means to boosting our growth?
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. She's absolutely right. I spoke about high growth sectors. Of course, in those sectors, one of the ways they drive up sustainable growth is through R&D. It's incredibly important. We are on track to spend, as a government, in terms of public expenditure, $20 billion by 2024-25, but also committed to a competitive regime on R&D tax credits to ensure the private sector does their side and ensures that we have, as far as possible, the highest level of R&D we can, and ensures that we can deliver investment and research into the industries of the future.
Colin Lockhart.
Mr. Speaker, the forecast is concerning for every corner of the United Kingdom. However, in Northern Ireland, there's an added uncertainty owing to the protocol and the internal barriers to trade at places within the United Kingdom. Investment to drive growth is now being stalled as we await a new agreement. Does the Government recognise the need to urgently restore the integrity of the United Kingdom's internal market to assist economic growth in Northern Ireland, and does he commit to doing that?
Well, the honourable lady makes an excellent point. We must deliver growth in every part of the United Kingdom. She knows the work that's happening across departments in terms of the protocol. But I would just make the general point. I've mentioned energy support before. She knows there are specific conditions that pertain in terms of the Northern Ireland energy market, but we've still put huge support in place, including the recent £600 payment, which shows, as I said earlier, we are on the side of families, and that absolutely includes every part of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Scott Benton.
I'm pleased that the Minister is focusing on the facts rather than the forecasts, which have been proven time and time again to be incorrect. And the facts of the matter are that, according to the IMF, last year we had the highest rates of growth of any nation in the G7, nearly double that of the US and high that of the whole Eurozone. A pretty good record, wouldn't you agree?
Well, my honourable friend is an absolute champion. He talks up this country because he's right. The facts back that up. It shows we should be optimistic. Of course, there are challenges. There are challenges. And we want to get on top of those challenges, which is why we have to work hard to support our independent Bank of England in getting inflation down. But like him, I'm optimistic that if we do that, we can see the sort of growth we had last year. And actually, that's what the IMF shows. Their cumulative forecast is that over 2022-24, we are predicted to have higher growth in Germany and Japan and at a similar rate to the US.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister seems to be walking away from the question about what role Brexit has played in this economic outlook, and I can understand why, because over half of his own constituents think it was a mistake. These benefits of Brexit seem to be like a toddler's imaginary friend. Ministers keep talking about them, but only they can see them. The Prime Minister's spokesman today told us that we are now seeing significant benefits from Brexit. So will the Minister set the record straight? Can he explain to the small businesses in our constituencies who used to be able to export with ease to the European Union
a single market where they now face a better deal than they did before?
Minister.
Well, I'm happy to stress, for example, the hugely important Solvency II reforms will be undertaken, which will free up enormous amounts of investment in infrastructure, because, of course, infrastructure is so crucial to future growth. I'm pleased to say, as a minister responsible for alcohol duty, we'll have reform in August, which means we can have differential duty between pubs and supermarkets, only possible because of Brexit. But I think the most important by far was when we were faced with the greatest challenge outside of wartime in this country, in the pandemic. This country was able to move fast with an amazing vaccine programme because of its independence, which reduced deaths and freed up our economy and allowed us to reopen and get growing again.
Paul Williams.
Speaker, today the Bloomberg UK scorecard reports that relative to London, life has got worse in areas that voted to leave the EU. This includes Ynysmon, where the Two Sisters factory has announced that it is closing in March, with 730 people losing their jobs, many of them from my Arfon constituency. Now, there's no point the Minister blustering about excuses around COVID and about Russia. The company says plainly Brexit is partly to blame. So no excuses, no apologies. What's he doing about it?
Hear, hear. Well, I'm obviously sorry to hear that. I don't know the specific circumstances. Obviously, we want to see strong investment and growth into this country, particularly in manufacturing. I can tell him, as he's aware, unemployment is about the lowest it's been for decades in this country. We're very proud of that fact. But obviously, where there are challenges, we want to look at them. And if he wants to write to me with the details of the case, I'll happily look into it.
Mr. Sherman.
Speaker, isn't it time the Minister tells the truth to my constituents? Isn't the truth that not only have they hollowed out our defence capacity, this government has hollowed out our economy? And will you also explain to my constituents why they've sent the cabin boy, the ship of shame over there, no crew there, no captain, no first mate, and they send the captain's cabin boy to answer questions on this most vital question of the moment?
Can I just say, he's an elder statesman of this House. I'm sure he can be pleasant if he really tried to. So I don't think it does this chamber any good with that kind of question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But if he wants to raise defence, I mean, he might want to explain to his constituents why at the last general election he backed the right honourable gentleman who was sitting up there earlier, the MP for Islington North, whose policy would have had us leaving NATO, undermine the nuclear deterrent, whereas in reality what we've done is to stand by the people of Ukraine in the face of a real war. We haven't deployed into the theatre, but we've done everything possible short of that. We've been training the Ukrainian army since 2015. So yes, I'll tell his constituents the truth. The truth is they should be proud of what this country is doing for the people of Ukraine.
Live effort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Minister thinks that the sanctions against Russia are having the desired effect. And if he thinks that they do, as I suspect he does, can he explain why the IMF is predicting that Russia will fare much better than us?
Well, I'm happy once again to refer to what the IMF said. As I said, at this morning's press conference, Pierre-Olivier Garinchas, their economic councillor, confirmed the good news. The UK economy has actually done relatively well in the last year. We've revised growth upwards to 4.1%. That's one of the highest growth rates in Europe.
Listen to this.
Mr. Speaker. He talks about other countries, but the reason that things are so bad in the UK is squarely down to the impact that Brexit is having on the economy, a Brexit that Scotland did not vote for. So can he tell me how piling austerity on austerity that has already taken place over the past decade, how is that actually going to help us out of this economic crisis the Tories have created?
It is astonishing that the Honourable Lady would say that all of our problems are solely down to Brexit. We have record energy bills. In the last year, as a country, we've had to find an additional £150 billion as a country to fund energy because of the invasion of an independent sovereign country by Russia. That was not our fault, nor was the pandemic our fault, where we put it, and the Honourable Lady talks about austerity, £400 billion of support in the pandemic, almost £100 billion of cost of living support and help with energy bills. That's not austerity. I'll tell you what that is. It's the United Kingdom Treasury backing every single part of the United Kingdom.
John Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wages in the North East are 3% lower than when Labour left office. Households have lost £11,000 per year because of lost wage growth under the Conservatives. And now the IMF forecast we are going to get poorer still, with prices rising and the economy contracting because the Conservatives crashed the economy. Can I ask the Minister if he came into politics to make people poorer? And if not, isn't it a time for a Labour government to deliver the British people prosperity?
I'm not sure if the Honourable Lady was there for my maiden speech. I entirely recognise she may not have been. I actually said in it that I'm a one-nation Conservative because I believe in not going back to the dark and divisive days of high unemployment. That's exactly what I said. And here we are with the lowest unemployment in almost 50 years. But on the specific point of regional earnings, I can confirm that pay has grown in every region faster than London, outside London, since 2010. It shows we are succeeding on our levelling up agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The IMF chief economist highlighted rising mortgage costs as a central issue facing the UK economy. I've heard from countless constituents fearful of losing their homes when their fixed rates come to an end, and others whose dreams of getting on the property ladder has been snatched away. So what guarantees can the Minister provide that interest rates will get back to the levels seen before the disastrous mini-budget?
Well, the Honourable Lady is experienced colleague. She is well aware that we have an independent Bank of England. Interest rates are their responsibility. But the crucial thing is we need to work in partnership with them. And the way we do that is by ensuring that fiscal policy does everything possible to support a stable framework in which inflation is falling. That's why we've set a target for inflation to halve. And if we do that, obviously, interest rates will be lower than they otherwise would have been.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The news from the IMF this morning is deeply concerning. Small businesses are at the heart of the local economy in my constituency of Newport West. So why does the Minister think that the Federation of Small Businesses is reporting that small businesses' confidence is at its third lowest level since they started tracking it?
Well, I'm grateful, Lady. I mean, she's right to mention small businesses. They make such an important contribution to our economy. And my message to small businesses, we've put in enormous amount of support to help them with energy costs. The £18 billion energy bill relief scheme over the last 6 months, and we're continuing to support them from April onwards. But of course, the best way to support them is providing a stable platform for growth, and that means inflation under control. It is the great challenge we face, and that's why, as the Chancellor said on Friday, the greatest tax cut we can provide is to reduce inflation, and that is what we are committed to.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK's economic decline, started by Brexit but exacerbated by the mini-budget, is genuinely sad, and it hurts millions of ordinary blameless people. In Northern Ireland at the moment we have some protection with the protocol, which, while imperfect, has economic benefits including dual market access, which has the potential to really transform our traditionally sluggish economy. Many businesses are already benefiting from this, and more investment will follow if the UK government will commit to supporting the protocol, and if that is accompanied by responsible, devolved government focusing on skills and infrastructure. Will the Minister commit to advocating in Cabinet for a pragmatic EU-UK deal? And if not, will he acknowledge that if the protection of the protocol is removed, more and more people in the centre ground in Northern Ireland will ask, when can we leave this Brexit madness through an agreed, dynamic, inclusive New Ireland?
Minister. Well, of course, the Honourable Lady knows the work that's happening across government in respect of the protocol, but she talks about our economic decline. I just want to be absolutely clear. Since 2010, the UK has grown faster than France, Japan and Italy. She knows, as I said earlier, there are 14 countries in the EU with higher inflation than we face at the moment. These are global challenges that we face. But we have the strength to get through it. And let me just give one example. As the Chancellor pointed out on Friday, there are only 3 economies in the world with a £1 trillion tech sector. Tech is a huge part of our future economic growth. One of those countries is China, one of them is the United States, the other one, I'm pleased to say, is the United Kingdom.
Patrick Grady.
There's a popular cafe not far from here on Regency Street, and they have a sign in the window this morning that says, "Breakfast only today. Sorry, we are badly understaffed." Now that seems to chime with the findings of UK in a Changing Europe that there's a 300,000 shortfall of workers as a result of Brexit and the end of freedom of movement. It seems that Brexit really does mean breakfast after all. So will the government not admit that it's Brexit that's taken the UK economy out of the frying pan and into the fire?
Well, of course, I don't know the specific circumstances why the cafe he refers to is struggling to recruit. I have no specific knowledge of it. I'm sure it offers a wonderful breakfast when it is able to, Mr. Speaker. What I can say, talking in aggregate, as is our standard, is that we're proud to have almost the lowest unemployment for the best part of 50 years. Of course, that does present challenges when you have a tight labour market. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we think the best way forward is to ensure we have the apprenticeships, the skills, the training to ensure that we can deliver the workforce to meet our growth ambitions.
Alan Brown. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He keeps continuing the Tory playbook of excuses, global headwinds, global challenges, other countries of high inflation, Putin's illegal war and the pandemic. But yet the reality is the UK is the only G7 country facing a recession this year. So is that due to Tory incompetence or is it the Brexit dividend?
I was very clear about the challenges this year in respect of inflation, which is why we need to have fiscal discipline, something which I don't think the SNP has the slightest understanding of, because I only ever hear them ask for more spending, more tax cuts, all unfunded, while meanwhile their fundamental policy is, were they to be independent, is to have a currency without a lender of last resort, a quite extraordinary proposition for economic instability. So we take no lectures from them. We've done everything possible to support people in every part of the United Kingdom, including Scotland.
Hi. Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker. I don't suspect there's much hope of significantly boosting overall productivity unless we deal with the huge geographical wealth imbalances we have within the UK. What consideration, therefore, is being given to using the so-called Brexit freedoms? And in the case of Wales, this could involve devolving VAT and corporation tax to empower the Welsh Government to get on with the job of boosting the Welsh economy. And if these powers, the so-called Brexit freedoms, aren't to be used, isn't the Welsh economy far better off back in the European single market and the customs union?
Well, he knows there is enormous benefit to Wales from being part of the United Kingdom. I've set out the many ways that we are boosting this country, and of course I gave the example of the changes to Solvency II regulations, which will hopefully see significant increase in infrastructure investment. That will be a massive benefit to every part of the United Kingdom, including to Wales.
Mr. Speaker, often during economic slowdown, retail and hospitality sectors are hit the hardest, particularly for companies trading in non-essential goods and services. What specific support is being considered for such businesses to ensure that redundancies are minimised and jobs are protected?
I have to say to the lady, she makes a very good substantive economic point, which is when inflationary pressures are higher, as they are at the moment, it is discretionary consumption which comes under pressure, and that means, for example, demand in pubs and shops and so on. So I can confirm we have taken huge steps to support hospitality, as we did in the pandemic. We recently announced that the 50% reduction in their business rates will be extended by another year and up to 75%. I announced in December a 6-month extension to the freeze in alcohol duty, but of course it's a really important sector, creating many jobs, and we want to see what more we can do to support it.
To complete the urgent question, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his answers to the urgent question? Being the only G7 country, according to the forecast, to have an economy set to shrink in this year, will the Minister consider increasing spending power in the United Kingdom by focusing on help for SMEs, which are the backbone for our economy and the job creators, and particularly for businesses in Northern Ireland, which are hit harder by the costs associated with the reprehensible Northern Ireland Protocol? Thank you.
Minister. Mr. Speaker, and as ever, you saved the best for last. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to continue being a stalwart champion of SMEs and small businesses in his constituency and indeed in Northern Ireland. That's why we're focused on growth in the whole of the United Kingdom, but underpinning that has to be fiscal stability and ultimately inflation falling. That's why the Prime Minister set the target to halve inflation. To get that down will be the best thing for consumers, it will be the best thing for small businesses, and it will be the best thing for our whole country.
Right, that completes the urgent question. We're now going to come to presentation of bills. Boris Sherman. Minister.
Seatbelts penalty points bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 24th of March, Mr. Speaker.
Friday the 24th of March. Thank you. Right. We now come to the 10-minute rule bill. Go on, Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to
been moved to be given leave to bring in a bill, the Clean Air Bill, as set out on the order paper in detail. I first moved a Clean Air Bill, in fact, on the 1st of November 2016 to coincide with the 60th anniversary of the Clean Air Act. And since then, obviously, I've been the chair of the all-party group, and so it's pleased to present this bill 70 years on from the Great London smog that incited that bill. And this is hot on the heels, of course, of another Clean Air Bill, the Clean Air Human Rights Bill, that I wholly support, because obviously we should have a right to life, we should have a right to a healthy environment and a right to clean air as set out by the United Nations. I'm very pleased that today we have in our presence Rosamund Adu-Kissimi Deborah, who has pioneered clean air, and this month, tragically, is the 10th anniversary of the death of her daughter, Ella, who was the first person to have air pollution as a cause of death on the death certificate. And the coroner there said it was crucial that we did enforce World Health Organization air quality standards and have a greater awareness of the public health risks amongst GPs and the public. And these provisions need to be in any Clean Air Bill or Act as Ella's law. Globally, we've got a situation where some 9 million people are dying prematurely of dirty air. In Britain, the figure is around 64,000 at a cost of 24 billion to the economy, to the NHS, in particular through productivity loss. And what we're looking at here, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is lung cancer, heart disease, strokes, diabetes, obesity, babies and children and all people being affected in their physical and mental health through their lives. These are avoidable risks. We had a situation where the Lancet is saying that 41 of 52 cities breached the World Health Organization 2014 standards of 10 micrograms per cubic metre for PM2.5. This is unacceptable. We've got a situation where pollution provokes allergies. There's something like 21 million people in Britain with allergies. We're in the top 3 nations in the world for allergies. We've got 5.4 million people with asthma. We know that air pollution provokes childhood asthma and sometimes, tragically, death. We know that with COVID, according to Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, the death rate in more polluted areas is 8 to 12% higher than otherwise. And this is particularly the case in the sort of poorer, more diverse and polluted areas, which account to a great deal why we saw such discrepancies in different groups in death rates and infection rates during the pandemic. These were avoidable. The focus naturally has tended to be on outdoor air pollution, the so-called natural environment that the Environment Act dealt with, talking about transport, industry, agriculture, etc., forgetting that we spend 90% of our time indoors, and something like 900 dangerous chemicals have been found indoors that impact on people's health. These range from building materials in volatile organic compounds, cleaning agents, flame retardants, cooking, of course, and mould and damp generate asthma. Candles, of course, are very unhealthy as well. And so we've got a situation of a cocktail of poisonous chemicals indoors, then mixing up with what's outdoors to provide major problems. We've seen some reduction in nitrogen oxides, but ironically, this will generate more ozone, which will generate more indoor air pollution. We've also got this growth of wood burners. Something like 1.5 million people have got these wood burners, often sort of middle-class people in urban environments who've got central heating, who are polluting themselves and their communities, because wood burners are actually 6 times worse than HGVs for generating particulates. And the government needs to be brave on this and take action in terms of restricting the use and sale of wood burners. The government's ambitions are, frankly, hopeless in relation to the EU in terms of our targets. The government said, oh, we will achieve 10 micrograms of PM2.5 by 2040, while the EU is saying they'll achieve that target by 2030, 10 years earlier, and that will mean thousands of unnecessary deaths in Britain. And this 10 micrograms isn't anywhere near to the WHO current guidelines, World Health Organization current guidelines of 5 micrograms. We know that the report commissioned by the Chief Scientific Officer, Sir Patrick Vallance, into indoor air pollution has found that we need better ventilation, better filtration, better indoor air quality to ensure that we can save, in their estimation, £1.3 trillion over the next 60 years. And indeed, the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, has also done a report to highlight the fact that there's much greater infection from poorly ventilated environments, and recommendations to improve that in terms of the work, home and transport infrastructure, as well as his focus on wood burners. We need greater awareness so that people who send their children to school know they're being polluted in the school and in the playgrounds, would generate political pressure on local authorities, MPs and other representatives to actually campaign for change. We need a holistic view. It's all very well DEFRA having some targets and the NHS picking up increasing numbers of people with all sorts of conditions, including dementia and lungs and brains and hearts, as I've mentioned. We need, obviously, the transport team involved in this. We need a fiscal strategy from the Treasury to deliver. So we need a holistic approach that brings together all the departments in a way that takes this seriously. We talk the talk on net zero, of course, but the truth is that both air pollution and net zero are generated by one thing, which is burning fossil fuels. So pollution and reducing air pollution should be seen as a driver for delivering net zero rather than a helpful byproduct, but that's not how it's seen. And we can have new innovation where, for example, we might generate hydrogen from off-peak renewables and feed that, for instance, into the gas grid. So when you boil your egg, there's both less a carbon footprint, but also the toxicity of what you're breathing is much less, in particular if you don't ventilate. We need proper enforcement. Under the EU, obviously, Client Earth was able to take the government to court and get fines implemented. We need those teeth in the Environment Protection, the Office for Environment Protection, which it currently hasn't got. The government's first duty should be to protect its citizens. Citizens have the right to clean air and health. And I know that my colleagues will be bringing in, with a Labour government, a Clean Air Act. In the meantime, it is imperative that we all do everything we can now to save as many lives as possible for Ella, for all our children, and for all our tomorrows. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Questions that the honourable gentleman have leave to bring in his bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes just about have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
John McNally, Leila Moran, Ben Lake, Rosie Duffield, Ian Byrne, Debbie Abrahams, Dawn Butler, Brenda Sharma, Dan Jarvis, Caroline Lucas and Christine Jardine and myself, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Geraint Davis.
Thank you. Clean Air Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 24th of March.
Friday, the 24th of March. We now come to the first opposition motion on crime and neighbourhood policing. Mr Speaker has selected Amendment A, tabled in the name of the Prime Minister. Yvette Cooper to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion in my name and that of the Leader of the Opposition. The motion is to restore and renew neighbourhood policing that has been decimated by 13 years of Conservative government. But before I talk about what's happening in our towns on policing and crime, can I just first briefly say something about the publication today of the police response to the Hillsborough inquiry? 97 people lost their lives as a result of what happened at Hillsborough 34 years ago, and families had to fight through decades against smears, lies and obfuscation to get to the truth. But they still don't have justice 34 years on. So the fulsome apology from the police today is welcome, and so too is their acceptance of some of the Bishop's recommendations about a duty of candour, something the government has previously voted against, as well as support for families at inquests. But this is already 5 years after the Bishop's report, and it's already 34 years after Hillsborough. So where is the government's response? They promised nearly 18 months ago we would have a response by the end of 2021, but the months and the years keep rolling by. We need a commitment to a Hillsborough law to address this. And I just say to the Home Secretary, her predecessor but four, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, did take this seriously, and we welcomed that. But it shows a lack of respect to the families who have endured so much and the communities who have supported them and fought for them to have no response right now. And I would ask the Home Secretary, I will happily give way to her if she wants to tell us when that government response to the Hillsborough report will be published.
I'll address my response to her afterwards.
I thank her and look forward to her response because she will know how important that is. Let me turn to neighbourhood policing. The number of people who say they never see the police on patrol on the streets has almost doubled since the Conservatives took office, from around a quarter of the population to half the population, half the country, saying they never or hardly ever see a police officer patrolling the streets. That's from the National Crime Survey. That is what 13 years of the Conservatives have done. At the same time, the number of criminals being caught or punished has plummeted. Since 2010, arrests have halved, prosecutions almost halved, community penalties halved, crimes solved halved. The proportion of cases that collapse because victims are giving up and dropping out has trebled. More crimes are being reported and recorded, but hundreds of thousands fewer crimes are being solved. Hundreds of thousands fewer victims are getting justice, and more criminals are getting away with it. And every one of us will have the cases in our surgeries, the residents who have complained about the drug dealers on the corner and nothing is done, the street drinkers who make them feel unsafe and nothing is done, the broken windows, the shop break-ins that just go ignored, the antisocial behaviour that escalates, the kids who've been expelled from school who just wander the streets, getting drawn into gang violence instead and nothing is done, the repeat offender back out of prison who no one is following up, and the domestic abuse victim who has no one to turn to because the police are so overstretched, the court delays are so long, and more victims are just giving up on the whole thing and walking away. I will give way in turn. I'll give way to the Honourable Member first.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, and I understand that her mission today and her job is to paint a sort of dystopian picture of crime. But before she elaborates on that, would she like to take this opportunity to congratulate the police on the very significant falls that we've seen, not just in specific crimes like burglary and robbery and knife crime, but also in overall crime? She will know that the Crime Survey in England and Wales published just recently that showed the year to September, showed overall crime now down 10% on pre-pandemic levels. Surely that's something she wants to congratulate the police for before she enumerates their sometimes obvious but nevertheless difficult failings.
It's your failing. So let me be very clear. I welcome the huge amount of work that police officers do every single day of the week to keep our communities safe. The police officers and the PCSOs who are overstretched, the detectives who are juggling huge caseloads that they really struggle to keep up with because there are huge shortages of detectives, because there's been no workforce planning by the government for year after year after year. And we know, I welcome too, some of the trends, the long-term trends in crime that started 25 years ago, but I would just say the government's motion today just rules out, eliminates online crime, despite that is the kind of crime that has soared over the last few years, where we have seen some of the big increases. And whilst government ministers may want to dismiss the huge frauds against pensioners who have lost their savings, the online scams or the grooming of children online, I think that we should take those sorts of online crimes, I think we should take fraud immensely seriously, because it is devastating and ruins people's lives. I will just give way to the honourable member, then I will come away to my honourable friend.
I'm extremely grateful for giving way. She's making a powerful speech. And I would wholeheartedly agree with her with what she is saying about uninvestigated, non-violent crime in particular, causing people to lose hope. And I keep hearing of people who don't bother reporting crime at all anymore. But may I ask her to elaborate, as she's already started to do, on online crime, and in particular on ID theft, which I've got a constituent of mine who's recently had her ID stolen. It has caused thousands of pounds of consternation to her and her family. The police want to investigate, but they just don't have the resources. Would you mind elaborating on Labour's plans for that?
Well, the honourable member is completely right, and we've seen changing patterns of crime with changing technology as criminals make the most of changes in new technology, and the problem is the police have not been equipped to keep up. And that ultimately is the responsibility of the government. And so it's no use government ministers or Conservative backbenchers blaming the police for the situation that the Home Office has put our police forces in, and the way in which they have not been able to keep up with changing crime and the changing pressures upon them as well. I give way to my honourable friend.
Grateful, my right honourable friend, for giving way. And, we know that the crime varies across the country, but she'll share my horror that knife crime in North East England has increased by 104% from 1,077 incidents in 2015 to 2,203 last year. That's hundreds more lives impacted by the government's failure to get on top of the serious crime in our region. We've had some so-called extra money in Cleveland, but still have hundreds of fewer police officers than in 2010. Does she agree there's a long-term sustainable plan?
Order. I really do have to explain to colleagues that there are a lot of people who want to take part in this debate. Using an intervention to make a speech when you're not on the Speaker's list is frankly not in order. Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, my honourable friend is right that what's happened on serious violent crime is obviously some of the most troubling, where we have had since, I think, 2015, a huge increase in serious knife crime and violence, and where we have seen some of the criminal gangs change their model to be able to groom more children, to draw young people into crime and into violence as a result. And it is our young people who we are seeing paying the price for the way in which the criminal gangs have been operating. That is why we put forward a proposal to change the law, to strengthen the law, to outlaw child criminal exploitation, to make it easier to crack down on criminal gangs. And I would urge government ministers who have voted against that proposal to accept that proposal and to take a much tougher line on the criminal gangs that are exploiting our children. And the problem is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that from policing to courts to our NHS to social care to our trains to our economy, after 13 years of the Tories, it just feels like nothing in Britain is working anymore. That is the damage that they have done. I will give way to them.
I'm very grateful to her. And Welsh Labour Government's Commission on Justice in Wales recommended that policing and crime policy be devolved to Wales to be aligned with social and health policy. Yet there are some on Labour, among Labour MPs who resist this, even though it is Mark Drakeford's policy, and that policing is, of course, devolved to Scotland, to Northern Ireland, and even to Manchester. Could she tell me whether it is ever likely that a Labour government or Labour in Westminster would recommend devolution of policing to Wales?
Well, the Welsh Government already does take a different approach in a way that I think is significant, because they have worked with police and crime commissioners in Wales. The Welsh Government has worked to support and fund additional police PCSOs. And that does make a difference and has made a difference in terms of the neighbourhood policing on Welsh streets. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Government has put down an amendment to our motion today, so that they can vote against Labour's plan to increase neighbourhood policing. And that is what honourable members opposite are voting for tonight. They are voting against Labour's plans to increase neighbourhood policing. Instead, they want us to welcome their efforts to increase police numbers. But who cut them in the first place? It was Tory MPs and Tory ministers who voted to cut 20,000 police officers from forces right across the country, from our neighbourhoods, from detective work, from response teams. And now they expect everyone to be grateful because they're trying to put some of them back. 20,000 experienced police officers gone. And they claim that they're on track to reverse the cuts. Well, actually, they aren't, because the number of officers leaving policing has been increasing. Because forces like North Yorkshire have said today they're leaving 120 vacancies unfilled so that they can make their budget add up. And the police aren't ending up on the streets either, because more of them are now behind desks, because police staff have been cut and bureaucracy has gone up, and because more of them are dealing with mental health crises and missing persons, because after 13 years of Tory government, the NHS and social care can't cope, and the police are having to pick up the pieces. Because there's a huge shortage of detectives, because there's been no national workforce plan, and everyone is having to try and plug the gaps. And there are 6,000 fewer neighbourhood officers and 8,000 fewer PCSOs, with the number of PCSOs having halved since 2010. So neighbourhood teams have been decimated, and that is why people say they don't see the police on the street anymore, because across the country they aren't on the street anymore. No wonder it feels like Britain isn't working. Communities are being let down. I give way to my friend.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Home Secretary for giving way. She was making an excellent speech. There's been 3,500 less PCOs now than in 2010, but it's not just the numbers. She talked about people behind desks. The estate is vanishing as well. In Ealing, we used to have Greenford, Hanwell, Ealing, Acton, 4 police stations. Now there's only 1 left. Police need places to do their paperwork as well. Would she agree with me?
My honourable friend makes a really important point, and right across the country over the last 13 years the police forces have closed police stations. Some of them are now HMOs with problems with antisocial behaviour instead. You could not make it up as a result of decisions that Conservative ministers have made. But look, it's good to see the Home Secretary here today, because we don't see her that much. And if I'm honest, I don't really know what she does. Because the Deluxe Secretary has been put in charge of doing antisocial behaviour.
She doesn't know how.
The Prime Minister has taken charge on small boats. The Navy's been in charge of patrolling the Channel. Didn't work, did it? No. The Deluxe Secretary, in fact, that much vaunted policy that they announced a year ago has ended up with actually record high levels of dangerous boat crossings. The Deluxe Secretary is also deciding on the Prevent Review and running Homes for Ukraine, while the Education Secretary, the Work and Pension Secretary and the Treasury have taken over deciding legal migration policy and have cancelled the Home Secretary's plan to bring back the net migration target or cut student numbers. The Immigration Minister has taken over asylum accommodation because when the Home Secretary was in charge, she broke the law. The Security Minister has taken over security policy because she can't be trusted not to leak. She's not charging criminals because that has got worse. In fact, the number of prosecutions fell by 20% when the Home Secretary was the Attorney General. She's not sorting out the Windrush scandal because she's cancelled all of that. She's not doing work on police standards, tackling misogyny or racism or violence against women and girls because she thinks all of that is woke. All of that fuss about the sacking this week of the member for Stratford as the Tory party chair and minister without portfolio, the real minister without portfolio, is still in office. Though she doesn't get let out much, she doesn't even do TV or radio interviews. So I don't think we've heard her in the morning for months, or on a Sunday for months, because she is the shadow of a Home Secretary. She is a shadow Home Secretary. So why doesn't she just get out of the way and let somebody else do the job? But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the absentee Tory Home Secretary isn't new. Successive Tory Home Secretaries have walked away from action to get justice for victims, to catch criminals or keep communities safe. So, knife crime is 71% higher than it was 7 years ago. Stabbings are up 63%. Knife-enabled rape is at a record high.
Will my honourable friend give way on that?
I will give way.
I'm grateful to her for giving way. The charge rate for rape is 1.6%, just 1.6%. And does she agree, therefore, with me that it is down to the large-scale cuts to policing and the CPS budget that conviction rates are so low, and the overwhelming majority of victims are not getting the justice they deserve? 13 years from this government, what they're doing is allowing rapists to go scot-free while victims suffer.
Absolutely. Exactly. 100%.
Well, my honourable friend makes a really important point, because the truth is that more criminals are getting off under the Tories as a result of the last 13 years of Conservative government. Criminals are not paying the price. So around 7,000 people will be the victim of theft today. Just over 4,000 of those thefts will be reported to the police. Only 180 of them will face court. So for thousands more victims, there will be no justice at all. And the worst figures of all are on rape. And it's worth having a look at the Conservatives' motion today, because it shows how low they've fallen and how out of touch they are. The truth is that the proportion of rape cases reaching charge is still 2/3 lower than it was 6 or 7 years ago, and it was too low then. But this motion is effectively boasting about an increase of 1/3 in the number of adult rape convictions in the last year. The number of convictions they're talking about in the course of a year is 532. It is the equivalent of around 1.5 convictions a day. So it may be perhaps up from just over 1 conviction a day the year before during the COVID crisis. And now think how many women are raped every day. An estimated 300. So we are supposed to be grateful and applaud the fact that in maybe 1.5 of those cases, rather than 1 of those cases, there might be a conviction. What kind of justice does it provide to the other 298 or 290 women that just 1 or 2 of those rapists were locked up? And what kind of shameless failing government thinks it should boast about that appalling failure in justice for women and girls? And I would say to members opposite today, that is the motion you will be voting for this afternoon. Voting against an increase in neighbourhood police and voting to boast about a truly dismal record in tackling violence against women and girls. I'll give way.
Thank the right honourable friend for giving way. Despite unprecedented levels of recorded rape and sexual offences, local authorities and charities are having to fight to keep victim support services, such as women centres, open. Meanwhile, the long-promised victim bill is nowhere to be seen. So, does my right honourable friend agree that alongside ending violence against women and girls, we must also prioritise supporting the victims of crime?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Where is the victims' bill? Where is the opportunity to provide proper support for victims of crime, not just for victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence, but victims more widely, victims across the board who need the support and too often have had the government turn its back on them and too often have been so badly let down. Where too is the action to get specialist rape investigation units in all of our police forces? Again, too often the government has turned its back. And as for all of their talk about powers or sentencing, the reality is they voted against Labour's policy for new powers to clamp down on the criminal gangs that are exploiting and grooming children. They voted against Labour's policy to increase sentences for rape and set minimum sentences. They voted against Labour's policy for increased monitoring and powers on domestic abuse repeat perpetrators. They voted to cut... I will give way to the honourable member if he can defend his government's decision not to make specialist rape investigations units mandatory and also not to vote for our minimum sentences in rape cases.
Well, she asked about sentencing in rape cases. I'd like to point out, firstly, that the average rape sentence now is nearly 2 years higher than it was after the last Labour government. And she talks about voting on rape sentencing. During the passage of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill last year or the year before, extraordinarily, in committee, Labour voted against a specific clause in the bill that saw people convicted of rape spending 2/3 of their sentence in prison rather than 1/3. Yes, they did. I was extremely surprised. So perhaps the Shadow Home Secretary can explain to the House why Labour voted against keeping rapists in prison for longer. You did.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party voted for minimum sentences for rape. We voted to increase sentencing for rape. But I would just say, actually, it doesn't matter what the sentencing powers are if nobody is being prosecuted and nobody is being sentenced in the first place. And the numbers of people who are being prosecuted and sentenced has plummeted. Victims are not getting justice. Record numbers of victims are ending up giving up on the criminal justice system because they have been so badly let down after 13 years of a Conservative government. How can a prosecution rate of 1.6% be anything other than a total shame, a total dereliction of duty by this Conservative government, Conservative Home Office and Conservative ministers? And remember too, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Conservatives also voted to cut Labour's counter-terror powers, ending control orders so that the TPIMs that replaced them are now barely used. They voted to cut Labour's antisocial behaviour powers. So what's left is barely used at all. We do hear now that they want to do something more on antisocial behaviour. They are fed up with nuisance neighbours holding loud parties or risky behaviour in the streets or in our cars, and they are thinking about bringing in more fixed penalty notices. Well, the Prime Minister certainly knows all about that one. The first ever Prime Minister to ratchet up not just 1 but 2 penalties for law-breaking in the space of 12 months, surrounded round the Cabinet table by multiple rule-breakers and other repeat offenders who chose to ignore warnings about rule-breaking by a record 4 of his Cabinet ministers that he appointed, and who's chosen to appoint, as his Home Secretary and his Justice Secretary, the 2 jobs most responsible for establishing respect for the rules, enforcement of the law, 2 people who he was warned in the autumn were both under suspicion for breaking ministers' own rules. I give way to the honourable member.
Mr Deputy Speaker.
Anna Firth.
Mr Deputy Speaker, would you ask the Shadow Home Secretary to explain what this has got to do, please, with the matter that we are debating this afternoon?
If I believed that the Honourable Lady was out of order, the Right Honourable Lady was out of order, I would have said so. Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have to say to the honourable member that if she doesn't see any connection between establishing respect in our communities, respect for the rule of law, respect for the rules, a sense of enforcement, and the behaviour of government ministers, on the fixed penalty notices, the law-breaking by the Prime Minister himself, then what she's doing is reflecting that same problem of this culture across the Conservative Party that it is just one rule for them and another for everyone else. No wonder no one takes them seriously on law and order anymore.
I said I would decide when the line has been crossed. The Right Honourable Lady is in grave danger of crossing the line. Yvette Cooper.
With respect always for the rules as well as for the rule of law. Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we need a new approach because this isn't fair on our communities. The collapse in neighbourhood policing, the collapse in justice for victims, isn't just making people feel less safe, it's also undermining our town centres and our local economies. And it's undermining respect for the rule of law and trust, the crucial, vital trust that lies at the heart of the British policing model of policing by consent.
Talking about respect, and we're also talking about trust, and I think we have to acknowledge that trust in the police has been significantly eroded of late. Does she agree with me that neighbourhood policing is actually critical to rebuilding that trust, and much better to see a police officer on the street who knows their local community and is known by them, as opposed to a distance passing in a response vehicle?
Well, I think the honourable member is exactly right, because it's having those police officers and PCSOs rooted in communities who know communities but who can also respond to communities and to community concerns. It helps to gather the intelligence about offenders and about perpetrators. It also helps prevent crime in the first place, helps build trust so that people feel more confident about reporting to the police. And I agree with her that it is crucial, alongside the other reforms I was just about to refer to, that we would also introduce a new law on police standards, making vetting compulsory, being clear on mandatory standards on training and misconduct, because with a very basic idea that, frankly, if a police officer faces allegations of rape or domestic abuse, they should be suspended, not just put behind a desk. Raising standards and increasing the community connections of the police is a really important way to support policing as well as support communities. I'll give way to Honourable Member.
Shadow Minister for our discussion of what's been forward today. I very much support the issue of community policing. Just Monday past, yesterday, we had a meeting with the Chief Inspector back in Northern Ireland to do with the cutbacks in police. One thing that he told us was community policing will be central to any policing going forward. Now, that's what we're doing in Northern Ireland. Does the Honourable Lady agree that should be what should happen here?
Well, I do agree it is what should happen here, and at the moment it's not happening. At the moment we still 6,000 fewer police officers, 8,000 fewer PCSOs, and with rumours that PCSOs may face further cuts over the next 12 months, just at a time when we should be supporting and working with communities instead of fear that actually things may be going further backwards. That is why Labour has set out plans for 13,000 additional police officers and PCSOs, funded by requiring forces to sign up for joint procurement and ring-fencing of some of the new recruits to go alongside the new law on police standards. The police across the country, there are police officers doing some phenomenal work. Those remaining police officers who are based in our communities and the PCSOs who work very hard every single day of the week. The officers who are attempting to solve crimes with huge caseloads and facing real pressure and trouble. But those officers need our support, and they need the additional neighbourhood policing teams in place to rebuild those connections. I give way to the honourable member.
Given way. I mean, clearly increased numbers is very important, but would the Right Honourable Lady agree with me? But in addition to that, we need to give the police officers the power they need to take a zero-tolerance approach to being where we need to robust in tackling people who blight our town centres and make life a misery for so many.
So I do agree that the police do need to have the powers to tackle serious abuse, antisocial behaviour, problems in our town centres. At the moment, there aren't police officers there. Too often they aren't on patrol and they aren't there. And I would just gently remind him it was his government, it was the Conservative MPs who all voted to cut antisocial behaviour powers and leaving people with powers that just aren't being used at all. Nobody's using the antisocial powers that they've even got, and it was ministers opposite and MPs, Tory MPs opposite, who voted to cut those powers in the first place. So we have to rebuild.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable, and she's making a fantastic speech. I just wanted to refer to hate crime, and we've seen a massive increase in hate crime over the last 10 years, from about 40,000 up to about 155,000 last year. And although we are seeing improvements around prosecutions, it's still less than 10%. This makes a huge difference to our communities and making sure everybody feels safe. What are your comments on that?
Thank you. My honourable friend is right, and these are also the kinds of crimes that if you have homophobic assaults, for example, or racist threats to people, that this can be hugely damaging. These serious crimes that are also undermine community cohesion as well. And it's really important that the police are able to respond, that they have the neighbourhood officers, that they also have the work on prevention, including, frankly, in our National Health Service, in our social services, to ease the pressures on the police that they need, that they currently face in terms of dealing with the missing persons or mental health crises as well. Mr Deputy Speaker, we are calling on the government to make a proper commitment to neighbourhood policing. That's what Labour would do, that's what a Labour government will do, is to have those additional police officers and PCSOs back in our neighbourhood teams, supported to work with the communities, going back to that core Peel principle where the police are the public are the police. The police are part of our communities, standing up for communities, but also getting justice for our communities, getting the prosecutions, getting the justice that victims need and victims have been denied for too long. That is what Labour believes in. The Tories have shown that they are weak on crime, weak on justice, weak and on law and order. That is why we need a Labour government now.
Question is, as on the order paper, Suella Braverman move the amendment. Home Secretary.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the amendment in my name on the order paper. So let me firstly address the issue of the Hillsborough report. The Hillsborough disaster was a devastating tragedy, and we recognise the significant impact that it continues to have on those affected, on their families and on their communities. The timing of the government's response has been impacted by the need to avoid the risk of prejudice during any criminal proceedings which are related to Hillsborough. Nonetheless, work has been underway, has been undertaken across all relevant government departments and organisations to carefully consider and address the points of learning which are included in the Bishop's report and to whom they are directed. As the National Police Chiefs Council is independent of government, it is for them to publish their own response independently of government, and that's a step that I welcome. But the government remains absolutely committed to responding to the Bishop's report as soon as practicable, and our focus now is on engaging in a meaningful way with the bereaved families of the Hillsborough disaster prior to publishing the government's overarching response. It's critical that lessons can be learnt from their experience and that they are not lost as we move forward.
Today's apology from the police is welcome but long overdue. Will the Home Secretary take the opportunity to commit to a Hillsborough law which would give victims of state-related death or disaster the parity of legal representation?
Well, I pay tribute to the indefatigable work by the campaigners who have worked for many years to ensure that the truth is known and that justice is done. I'm supportive of all work to help them ensure that their voice is heard in the process. Let me take that away and consider it fully before I put a meaningful response to it. Mr Speaker, we've heard from the Shadow Home Secretary, and her performance is really worthy of an Oscar. We're in awards season, I think. She's strong on alarmism, strong on hysteria, a little weak on facts. This government is proud of its record on crime and policing. Since 2010, and indeed since 2019, we've delivered more police and less crime. Thanks to government funding, our streets are safer and there are fewer victims of crime. I'm not complacent, however. I know there remain many challenges, and I will not rest until we restore confidence in the police and until everyone feels safer in their communities. So let's go through the facts. I want to make some progress and I'll take some interventions later. The facts. Fact number one, achievement number one. We are on track, this government is on track to deliver the most police officers in the history of policing in England and Wales. We're on track to deliver 20,000 new police officers by March 2023. And in that regard, I want to pay tribute to my right honourable friends, the members for Whittam, the members for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, and I see my right honourable friend, he was in the chamber, the right honourable, my member for North West Hampshire, for their leadership of that mission.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way. In Nottinghamshire, we have 405 more police officers as a result of the policing uplift. Many have gone into the neighbourhood policing teams, so we have new beat officers in villages like Keyworth and Ruddington. Will the Home Secretary join me in thanking Inspector Rob Lawton and his neighbourhood team for the brilliant work they do in Rushcliffe? And could she also tell the House when the long-awaited review into the police funding formula will begin, so that great forces like Nottinghamshire can get the resources they deserve?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and I do join her in paying tribute to the police leadership in her county and her force. It's thanks to strong leaders in her police force that we have higher police numbers, more bobbies on the beat, more visible, more responsive policing at the heart of our local communities. And on police funding, we're going to begin consulting very soon so that we can ensure that the resources and the money reaches the front line where it's needed.
To my right honourable friend giving way, and can I welcome the 231 new police officers in the West Mercia region, very welcome indeed. But it's not just about numbers, it's also about innovation. And West Mercia being very innovative with Shifnal Town Council and other town councils like Newport potentially having a community hub where there can be a permanent police presence, but the capital and revenue costs are shared across the community and there is a one-stop shop for a lot of public services. Does she agree that model is worth looking in more detail to perhaps roll out across the whole of Shropshire and the West Midlands?
He's absolutely right. There is huge innovation and good practice around the country when it comes to local policing. Police forces are using the powers that we've given them here in government. They're using the numbers and the resources that we've given them here from government to be more responsive, to be more visible, to ensure that people feel safer and crime is falling. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will carry on and I will come back to it. From Greater Manchester to Kent, from the Thames Valley to West Midlands, on my visits around the country, I've seen so many brave men and women join the police, coming forward in their droves to protect the public. And on behalf of the British people, I thank them. 19 forces have already hit record levels. The Met, Kent, Norfolk, South Wales, Suffolk, Warwickshire and West Yorkshire Police all have the highest numbers of police officers in their history. Higher than 2019, higher than 2015, higher than 2010, higher than the years that Labour were in charge.
Would the Home Secretary explain why in the West Midlands we will still have 1,000 fewer police officers than we did in 2010? 1,000 fewer police officers this year than we did in 2010.
The Honourable is just not right. As of the 31st of December, our police uplift programme has recruited an additional 16,000 new officers, bringing us to a total of over 145,000 nationwide, with more, in a welcome sense, more female and ethnic minority officers than ever before. Now, that is no accident. That all took planning and funding by this government. And what did Labour do? They voted against. Achievement number 2, crime is down. Despite the naysayers on the opposition benches, since 2010...
Home Secretary just sort of inventing things there. Can I just ask her, the police workforce, her own workforce statistics show that there are 6,000 fewer neighbourhood police officers and 8,000 fewer PCSOs. And half the country say they don't see police officers on patrol. How does she explain that shocking decimation of neighbourhood police?
I disagree with her characterisation, and it's helpful for her, obviously, to play with the figures. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, if we look at how we are classifying roles in policing, what we do see is that when it comes to incident and response management, numbers are up. When it comes to local policing, the 22 figures were actually greater than 2015. So you can move around the deck chairs and you can play with the figures all you like. The reality is we are on track to have a record number of police officers. So let me get back to the facts on achievement number 2. Crime is down. Despite the naysayers on the opposition benches, since 2010, according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, the most authoritative evidence of crime compiled by the ONS, burglary is down 50%, robbery is down 45%, and violence is down by 46%. That's 500,000 fewer burglaries, 180,000 fewer robberies, and 700,000 fewer victims of violence than 2010. Crucially, overall crime, excluding fraud and online crime, is down by 48% compared to 2010. I just hope the Labour Party will take this chance to reflect and actually apologise to the British people for the disgraceful state in which they left this country, and moreover, for objecting to our measures to fix the mess that they left.
The Home Secretary.